Robin McIntosh, que nos acompaña en las siguientes 2 horas o hora 45 minutos. Él va a presentar la conferencia Reproductores de Camarón, la importancia de la salud y la genética para su cría avanzada, y además nos dará un panorama de las tendencias de la producción mundial de camarón, de la cual también tiene bastante información. Robbins es vicepresidente ejecutivo de Charoen Foods, es una compañía pública, y de Homegrown Shrimp en Estados Unidos. Robbins McIntosh es, bueno, la empresa, Charoen Foods es una empresa, una empresa integrada de producción de camarones de acuacultura más grande del mundo. Sus responsabilidades incluyen la gestión de los programas genéticos. Las responsabilidades de Robbins en esta empresa incluyen la gestión de los programas genéticos y desarrollo de los reproductores de camarón. Como parte de este proceso, supervisó la producción bueno, el señor McIntosh se unió a CPF en el 2001 y se le asignó la tarea de revivir la división de acuacultura de camarón de la compañía. Como parte de este proceso, supervisó la introducción de Litopenos vanamei en Tailandia, el desarrollo de SPF, o reproductores libres de patógenos de Penos Monodon, y la modernización de los criaderos y las granjas. Su trabajo en CP aumentó la producción de camarón en la compañía de 5.000 toneladas a más de 90.000 toneladas anuales para el 2010. Estos cambios se introdujeron en CPF. Finalmente se abrieron paso a la mayor parte del cultivo de camarón asiático. Posteriormente se diseminó la genética y la mayoría de las granjas incrementaron su producción alrededor, convirtiendo a la industria estancada en una de las historias de crecimiento más dinámicas nunca antes vistas en la acuacultura. Bueno, sin más preámbulo, Robbins, go ahead, please.
Buenos dias, and gracias para todos. And let me thank Salvador here for inviting me. He gave me the option of Zoom or in person. First time I've done in person in 2 years. I couldn't resist the opportunity to actually travel a little bit again and see some things. So I thank Salvador. Also, Salvador was the first journalist to come visit me in Belize back in '97. And so I have fond memories of the dinner that we had back in the old days. And this is the first chance I've been in Mexico in 27 years now. So again, I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you for coming.
He also told me that I need to do 2 talks, which I'm not sure is good for you. I'm not sure it's good for me, but I will do it. And the first talk was Trends in World Shrimp Production. This is really not my job, but for some reason, this has become a hobby of mine, and everybody thinks that I do shrimp statistics. So I'll give you an outline or an overview of where I think we are in terms of the world today and the trends going forward. And the reason that I do this is really when you're developing corporate strategies and you want to know where things are going so you can try to get there first and understand a little bit of where the pitfalls may be. It's also important for breeding. So I kind of take an interest in what's happening throughout the world. Well, actually, what we have at the top is the Americas. And what you would see there is essentially the Americas are picking up percentages relative to the world. And of course, the star of the Americas is Ecuador, which picked up 150,000 tons last year and continually grows, passing the 1 million ton mark. Now, I don't really think that Ecuador was the first country to pass the 1 million ton mark, because China did it back in 2009. It's just that they've fallen off the chart since then. And in Asia, basically, you have China, India, Asia, minus China and India, being what that is, and then you have the others. So we're basically at 4.6 million tons last year, and I believe we'll probably break 5 million tons next year, given the caveat that the markets don't turn against us and farms stop stocking. Because you'll find in Asia, if market prices go down where they don't have a comfortable buffer for profits, they will just stop stocking. And so production will quickly correct. So again, I think the real trend is that Latin America is gaining market share. If I look in 2008, America was about 13%, and Asia was 82%. Today, America is back up to about 31%, with Asia being 65%, and America is actually gaining market share over time. And I think that makes sense, especially since we see some intensification going on in the Americas, and the Americas have got a lot more unexploited resources than does Asia. So I believe that trend will continue. And of course, as I said, Ecuador is the story of the Americas. If you look at the Americas, Ecuador is about 72% of the Americas. And it's been growing at 32% a year, whereas the rest growth rate is only 1.5%. So it really is a growth story that's fueled by Ecuador. And in Asia, it's a story fueled by India, Vietnam, and Indonesia. And the rest, only 0.2%. These are 25%, 13%, as you can see. And Monodon has started to come back a little bit in the last couple of years. Two reasons. We now have a domesticated SPF Monodon that performs very, very well. And so we really see it taking off in China. We expect to see it take off in India. It's where it goes, it does well. It will not overtake vanamei, but it is a viable option to vanamei, especially since it has the unusual characteristic of not dying when vanamei dies. So for whatever the reason, Monodon doesn't seem to be affected by EMS, doesn't seem to be affected by EHP the same way vanamei is. So oftentimes, like in India or Vietnam, where farms have difficulties, Monodon does well. If farms don't have difficulties with vanamei, they will grow vanamei because you will outproduce with vanamei. So these are what I consider the risk factors for 2022. We have inflation, so we're going to have higher costs. In 2021, feeds, which are the major costs, they controlled their prices to the farmer. Those prices will go up this year. So PL price will go up, feed price will go up, and if we don't see an increment in prices offered to the farmer, then basically I think that will impact which farmers stock and which farmers don't stock. Now, in the beginning of 2022, stocking is very aggressive. So it looks like there's going to be a lot of production coming out in the first half. It really will depend on how consumption holds up. We know that the United States has had record consumption for the last few years. Will that continue to go up, which is really driving much of the production that's exported? Or will that even up or go down if prices get too high? Shrimp price in the United States at retail level went up about 12% last year, which was low relative to other livestock. Beef was up over 60%. Chicken was up around 20%. So shrimp had a good year relative to inflation parameters, but as the costs of shrimp production go up, we will see inflation go up at the retail level. Will that turn the consumer off, or will the consumer continue to eat shrimp and allow farms to produce more and more shrimp? We've seen a number of increased severe weather. The number of typhoons, droughts, unusual weather events in Asia have definitely increased the last 3 or 4 years. Last year, India probably lost 15,000, 20,000 tons due to typhoons. That trend, I think, will probably continue. And how that will impact will really depend on what kind of events we get. One thing that is also true, I think there's no new diseases on the horizon. So disease, when you first have an emergent pathogen, it takes 3 years before it has world impact. So I can confidently say that there's no new diseases that are going to impact this year's markets. That's not to say that we have no disease. The diseases we have been normalized. It's expected. It's not unusual. So when new diseases, I mean things that are not expected, that are basically above or below the normal point. And so, in looking at the future for the next 10 years, first of all, how much shrimp do we need? If we start overproducing relative to the markets, prices will be impacted in such a way that farming will become less desirable. That will correct itself. And right now, I think most people think that the world will take whatever shrimp you can produce. And that has been true for the last 20 years. Whether that remains true in the future, I think that's something to watch. Resource availability and development cost. In Asia, there are no new resources. And in Latin America, there are also declining new resources. So what we're getting is intensification and rescoping of technology to get more from less. And again, sustainability, efficiency, and technology will be a major theme going forward in the shrimp industry relative to keeping it growing. As I said, I think the greatest risk are markets now. We are really on a strong uptrend in production. Whether we can maintain that strong uptrend in consumption with an inflationary background, that is a question that only this next year will answer. So the main presentation that I prepared really is going to be a mix of different things. I haven't really presented very much in the Americas. I do much more in Asia. So in Asia, I target topics because I know what has been presented before. People know me a little bit better. Here, I'm not sure where we stand in terms of what you know and what you don't know relative to ideas I might have. So I put together a potpourri of different things, all of it hopefully having something to do with health and breeding. I look at everything from an historical background. Again, I started this in the late 1970s, and we've been through some rough stages since then. And I've witnessed it all. And if I go back and look at the very beginning, this is Latin America. Take the aerators out. We didn't have aerators in the beginning. And, we had a lot of variable outcomes. And in fact, the way I look at that age was we were more concerned with market price than we were with the technology, because we couldn't control the technology. It really was a gamble. When you stocked a pond, you just hoped there was a good price at the other end. You had no confidence in what you were going to get out other than luck. And so basically market prices is what sustained the industry. And prior to 2000, everything was wild. Here I just show some pictures of wild collecting in Bangladesh. This is collecting wild broodstock in Thailand in 2000. And I show a picture in 1989, Monodon. It was healthy. So wild shrimp in the beginning were healthy. I understand back in the early 80s, 30-gram vanamei were easy. It was very consistent. There weren't a lot of health issues. But everything changed about 1988, 98 to 99 when we got white spot. That was the event that switched the Americas from wild, which was cheap and dependable, and many people thought wild was just a lot stronger than anything you could do domesticated, into the domesticated stocks. At the same time, America was dying from white spot and changing over. Asia had what we call slow growth syndrome. And you basically got lots of size variation. The average size in processing plants had dropped from 28 grams in 1990 to 2002. It was down to 16 grams. And the farmers woke up one day and they realized they're losing money. FCRs were going up. Profits were non-existent. The first time I went in 2001, you couldn't even get a cup of tea out of a farmer. They were basically disheartened people that were in a dying industry. So I labeled this slide, Relearning What Health Is and Is Not. For most farmers, health is a dead shrimp. So if the shrimp is still swimming around, it's okay, it's healthy. The fact is, health is a lot more than just a dead shrimp. Even today, if a shrimp is not dead, farmers sometimes have a very hard time differentiating healthy from non-healthy. So non-healthy is not just being dead. Most people will look at slow growth or these pictures and call that inbreeding. I've seen, experts go out to field and find a picture like this and say it's inbreeding when it's EHP. But this is not healthy. And this is essentially my hand back in 2001 looking at the Monodon when they were diagnosing no new viruses. They called this healthy. They just didn't understand why they were losing money. They thought it was poor management, poor feeds, anything and everything but health issues. So I labeled this basically the change of where we're going, I believe. We came from the Don Leitner era. That's the era of post-mortem. We find out why the shrimp died, but the shrimp is dead. It's an era that had to happen, creation of the diagnostics. But the era going forward in health is one that I think is exemplified by somebody like Dr. Aldag, where we're looking to reduce the risk and keep shrimp alive and keep shrimp healthy. If they die, they're dead. You're not having any benefit. It's important to know why they die, but it's more important to know how to reduce the risk of them dying and to keep them healthy. So this kind of shows what happened when we adapted domestication. So 90 through 99, 2000 is the era of wild shrimp. And you can see it's kind of a flat growth curve. When we took the vanamei, the domesticated vanamei, the SPF vanamei, to Asia in 2001, the explosion happened. That explosion would not have happened without the introduction of clean SPF vanamei. Monodon, as you can see, stayed flat. Very little growth in Monodon. It was not domesticated, it was wild. The SPF concept was developed for a need in Hawaii when they got IHHN, and they went through this thing and cleaning the shrimp or whatever, getting rid of IHHN, and it basically solved that problem. One of the myths that have come out of that is that to have SPF, it's an island. So if you don't have an island, you can't have SPF. Really, islands and SPF have very little in common, other than when you talk SPF, you always think of an island. And then we had the myth of SPF, that it's weak. And this was created from Hawaii. That's the original SPF. And of course, they shipped it to Ecuador. We had the disaster with TSV. They shifted it to Texas. TSV, again, created a disaster. They shifted to Taiwan. Taiwan did really well the first year, and then it was a disaster. They shipped it to China. Did really well for 1 year, and then a disaster. They shipped it to Thailand, a disaster after 1 year, because they didn't understand what SPF was at that time. I think Texas does kind of illustrate what it is. So pre-SPF, Texas was at about 1,000 tons. They introduced the SPF, and it comes up to 2,000 tons. Now, one thing we find when we clean a population of shrimp, not genetic, just cleaning, making healthy, you get a 20% increase in growth rates just by cleaning the population. So here we had that increase in growth rate. Then TSV comes in because we're not understanding tolerance or impact of viruses at that time. It drops it, but as they create tolerant stocks to TSV, the SPF comes back, the SPF SPT at that time. Now, I went to Belize in 1995, and my intention after hearing about SPF was, my history had been with the wild animals of Guatemala, of Honduras. In Mexico, Acapulco was my last place of station that died of TSV, wild animals. And I wanted nothing more to do with wild animals. You know, I have a saying that if it's broken, you got to fix it. I couldn't tell you why the wild animal was broken, but it needed to be changed. So when I went to Belize, I had a clean slate. There's no wild animals over there. You have to import something. So what do you import? Gonna try the Hawaiian stuff. And so brought the Hawaiian stuff in, and it did really, really well. So again, the SPF is weak, has no disease resistance. Everything has some tolerance. Some have more tolerance than others. SPF grows fast. This is something that really came up with EMS, you know. It grows fast, it dies fast. My comeback to that is dead shrimp don't grow fast. And that shrimp must have an exposure to a wider range of pond pathogens and undergo pond selection pressures to succeed. No, if you know technology, genetics don't need pond pressure and exposure to pathogens to succeed. And hopefully I can show some of that to you today. Now, what we needed with SPF, especially from Hawaii, was controlled environments and biosecurity. These are concepts that were just not even known or talked about in 1996. But in Belize, that was the overlay. We put in, as we understood it, basic biosecurity at the pond level with the SPF stocks, and it worked really well. That would be exclusion. So again, when we talked about biosecurity in the old days, 95 to 2010, we talked about exclusion. We're trying to exclude viruses, we're trying to exclude parasites, etc. But when EMS came, exclusion no longer works. So the biosecurity concept, I moved to limitation. So if you limit the amount of pathogen and you increase a tolerance at the same time, you can essentially introduce workable biosecurity again. So that's the limitation model, where again, we find that with EMS in particular, it's not really a bacterial infection as we understand infections, it's a toxicosis. The bacteria actually produces an insecticide and it's deposited in the bottom of ponds. And when the shrimp eat old feed, because old feed collects the toxin very fast, or it eats sludge, or all that crap on the bottom of the ponds, they die very fast. It's not necessarily from the stomach. It's not necessarily from the shrimp itself. It is really eating concentrated levels of old feed and old feces or sludge in the bottom with high concentrations of toxin. And that's why the toilet works. If we keep the pond bottoms clean, we remove enough toxin that shrimp are not impacted as they were in the beginning. So when we brought SPF to the Asia back in 2002, we had to redesign everything. So we had ponds without biosecurity. So we reconfigured. We introduced biosecurity. There was a cost to that, but we went through the cost. And here I show basically we got the bird screen to prevent the birds. We closed the systems of the ponds, so we're recycling pond water. The slide here shows an auto feeder. To me, that's part of biosecurity. Because if you've got EMS, you cannot broadcast. You have to dribble the feed little by little. Otherwise, you will concentrate toxins and create problems. So for me, things like the auto feeder actually become part of the concept of biosecurity. 2012, APINs, we had to reconfigure biosecurity again. More control is needed, so pond sizes had to come down. The shrimp toilets were developed to basically make sure the pond bottom stayed clean. And we needed higher aeration. As we increased the genetics, the growth potential in genetics, their metabolic rates increase. To stay healthy, they need higher oxygen levels. And so we're continually increasing the amount of oxygen inserted into a pond. When we started back in 2002, probably we get 500, 550 kilograms per horsepower. Now we'll put in 300, we'll put in 1 horsepower for 300 kilograms of biomass. And the final step here I show is when EMS came, we started breeding tolerance. Not by exposure per se, but by the genetics of tolerance to the EMS toxins. And so you can see in 2013, 40% survival. By 2017, we were up to 80% survival. I would say we're probably about 90% survival today when it comes to an EMS challenge. This would be the model pond for post-Apens EMS. Again, more aeration. We've got the feed tray in the feeding area, and then you have the center pit or the toilet. In this pond, since our feed trays, our feeders are configured to about 600,000 PLs or stocking per feeder, this pond has probably got 1.2 million PLs stocked. And so it needs 2 platforms. If it had 1,800,000, we'd have 3 platforms. That's kind of our calculation or our feel for how many shrimp can feed at the table without running other shrimp away. Now I kind of want to go over, because, you know, being on the other side, I hear all this discussion about SPR and APE and SPF, and there's just a misunderstanding of SPF, what it is and what it is not. All SPF is health status. There's no genetic link to health status, to SPF. It's a health status. It means it's free of pathogens. And I just wonder, why is it bad to be free of pathogens? Personally, I don't want to sell a farm a pathogen. I want to, because that's, again, the first premise of exclusion biosecurity. No pathogens introduced with the stock. So SPF has nothing to do with tolerance resistance. It has to do with health status only. When we talk about specific pathogen resistance, that's genetic characteristic, and that characteristic says the shrimp cannot become infected. So if I'm exposing the shrimp to the pathogen, it will not get infected. That's resistance. There really is no resistance that we know of today in shrimp. I'll hedge that a little bit. There's some indications of some resistance. There is resistance in a Monodon stock in Taiwan. It requires a homozygote to be resistant, and it's so far eluded breeding commercially. There may be some indication in vanamei of a similar homozygote that basically will create resistance. But most of what we talk about is tolerant shrimp. That also is a genetic character, where the shrimp can get infected, so the shrimp are infected, but the shrimp have an immune system or the ability to control that infection so it doesn't go to a level that the shrimp becomes diseased. So I'll demonstrate here with this graph of the different stocks. So this first graph is low tolerance. This might be the Hawaiian stock for white spot. So 27 degrees, it will start to die, and then it will stop dying, and maybe say 35%. This would be an experience I have with stocks I have in Asia. But if I drop it to 24 degrees, it'll finish dying. 24 degrees, very few shrimp, if any shrimp, can control white spot. Now, the next one would be high tolerance. So this might be, you know, something out of the Americas that is considered high tolerance. At 27 degrees, you get very high survival. But if I take it down to 24, it will also start to die. So again, even a tolerant shrimp, if challenged with lower temperatures or higher levels of infection, can die. And the next would be resistance. So it starts to die. This would be the Taiwanese Monodon strain. Starts to die, but 50% are resistant, 50% are not. So the non-50% that are not resistant die. When it gets to the 50% that are resistant, even at 24 degrees, they don't die. They're not infected. So if they're not infected, you're not going to die at any temperature from that particular virus. Now, what I found is the domesticated pathogen-free stocks have been really essential for phenotypic selection. And that's been the base of everything I have been involved in developing both the vanamei and the Monodon stocks of Asia. So here's the Monodon. Again, before, it didn't look like this. After we create SPF and domesticate it, we got very uniform CVs, and the Monodon naturally today perform better than the wild Monodon did in 1990. So it's really a nice shrimp today. On the vanamei, CVs of less than 12, and this is a typical harvest at 42 grams in 100 days. Now there's two methods that are contrast in how we develop an SPF population. The original Hawaiian concept would not be the concept I would follow today, but that's the concept that was followed in Hawaii. And that's where they took the animals out of the wild, and then they looked for pathogen-free stocks. So there was no built-in tolerance to those animals. They were just wild animals. We're looking for freedom of pathogens. The second was actually developed by Dr. Alday in Ecuador, also in Nicaragua, where she would find populations that had been exposed to pathogens for years in ponds. And then she would go into those ponds that had tolerance and select out the disease-free animals. So those animals already had built-in tolerance, and now they are pathogen-free once you go through the SPF protocols. And the fancy term we use for that is reverse SPF. So SPF generally refers to the Hawaiian methodology of going to the wild, finding clean. The reverse is going to infected areas and finding clean. So the reverse SPF is proven to be very, very useful. But it is tolerant. It's not resistant. So here is some challenge work that I've done in Thailand. And this would be the normal Hawaiian. If I'm exposing this to white spot, I will get a real-time DNA level or white spot of 10 to the 6th. They die at 10.6. If I can keep it below 10.6, they won't die. So the tolerant stocks keep the DNA level under 10.3. They're infected, but they don't die. This animal was brought to Saudi Arabia. You can see the introduction of the animal is in 2013, and immediately in a white spot background, production has skyrocketed in Saudi Arabia with an SPF animal that is white spot tolerant. As I said, I find SPF a very good platform for improving phenotypic type characteristics. So this shows the CP program for vanamei. It started in 2001. It takes 140 days to grow the PL to a target size of 24 grams. By 2017, the target size has been increased to 30 grams. And to grow that same PL in 2017 to 30 grams is now only 72, 73 days. Today, it's even faster than that. I just haven't updated this chart. On the other hand, while you're doing growth, you're also looking at specific diseases that you need to have tolerance to. The first disease challenge for Asia was TSV. So in the beginning, the Hawaiian stocks, basically we would only get 65% survival in the TSV background of Thailand and Asia. After creating tolerance or selecting the tolerance within a nucleus, so no exposure to the animals, but just the genetics, we're essentially 100% resistant to TSV. In fact, I haven't seen a TSV diagnosis in Asia since maybe 2008. It's kind of extinct now. Apins basically hit Thailand in 2012. We got a very low survival. You've seen what happened in the industry. We went 650,000 tons down to, I think it was 180,000 tons at the bottom of apins. But again, creating a challenge test, not exposing and infecting, but outside of exposure, selecting the genetics, we'd have been able to increase the tolerance to apins up to 85. I think, as I said, today it's about 90%. Then there's always the concern, as you improve growth, do you impact survival? Looking at all of the data that we've created in our systems, we see no correlation that would show that. But I think in a more simplistic way of looking at it, let's look at TSV. Now there's a disease that killed. We've created almost 100% tolerance, but in those TSV tolerant shrimp, in certain families under ideal conditions, I can get 1.2 grams a day. So that's tolerance and 1.2 grams a day. I cannot say that the tolerance has impacted the growth rate. Now, why do some people say it does? Because to get both, you have to have a very complicated program that has multiple families and you're doing multiple selections at the same time. Otherwise, you will select one over the other. So you have to select both at the same time. Okay, now in the Americas, this term ape came up. All pathogen exposed. And yes, it certainly has made and defined the Americas. But in exploring ape, why it works, why it doesn't work, what's become clear to me, especially since I've had some experience now in Brazil with intensive, in Guatemala with intensive, ape is good for low density. At some point, the stresses in ape come to the point that you get the same problems we get in Asia. And if I look at the ape selection program in Ecuador, and this is just for 2015. I know they've made a lot more advances since then, but in the beginning, there was really very little improvement in anything from these selection programs. For me, to have a phenotypic selection program, there's G by E. You have to keep the E constant. Part of the E is the health of the shrimp. So if the shrimp has variable health, it's very hard to have precise selection on phenotypes. So this is the example that kind of really reoriented my thinking on much of this. So in Brazil, we have a farm. It's called Caminor. It's got two parts. One is intensive. There's the intensive part over there on the right. The other is basically Ecuadorian extensive, 10, 12 per square meter stocking. Same hatchery, same PLs, not SPF. We go to the low density, there's no disease. In fact, we're getting record profits from those ponds. We put those PLs in an intensive system. Now I've got IM&V, I've got EHP, and I think I got another one too. The farm is bankrupt, no work. The only difference is the stresses of the intensity. The PL is the same. It's not SPF. So for this intensive system to work, you must have SPF. You cannot start with pathogens because the stresses that you build up with intensity will bring the pathogens out. And so I kind of show this stress thing. Now this is artificial laboratory stuff that I did, or we did. This was with apins at 10 to the 4. Now normally apins won't kill until 10.5, 10.6. But I set this at 10 to the 4, and I set the stressor at 20 ppm nitrite. Now there's a bunch of things that stress. So any of these things can stress. My definition of stress is reduce the innate immune response. And so when I add 20 ppm nitrite, my survivals are here. These are different families. So 38, 35, But if you look at the non-stressed result with the same inoculum, the same background aphids, almost no impact. If I stress it, they die. You don't stress it, they don't die. I could show you 50 different examples of that. So stress is really one of the differentiators, and when you have an intensive system, you are going to have more stress than if you don't have an intensive system. Very low stress in the extensive, much more stress in the intensive. Is it true? Gosh, you would be the hell I went through when EMS hit Thailand and all the grief that SPF got. And everybody wondered, why do you not go away from SPF and go to APE? I could find no evidence that APE gave me any advantage, and it gave me a lot of disadvantages. In fact, I went to China in the very beginning, and I said, look, all those people that are growing APE that says they're doing better, get me samples. Let me see. And in the end, maybe they had 1 day more life, but economically, there was no difference between SPF and APE in China. Then the apes started coming into Thailand. So I was able to get ape 1, ape 2, ape 3. These are different smuggled populations of South American shrimp. With the moniker, these basically will put SPF out of business. And again, I brought them into our challenge center, did careful work. And so here's the Apens challenge. And this is the survival. So ape 1 gave me 21, ape 2 gave me 60, ape 3 gave me 55, and what I call the select SPF. Now that would be the SPF, I think I was probably in the 2nd or 3rd year of selection for Apens tolerance. I got 62. And if I did what I call a plus, where I actually put an overlying epigenetic factor on top, it was 78. SPF genetics equivalent or slightly better than ape. But the growth rates, the mean body weight, 3.6 at this 35 days, 3.6, 2.5, 2.2, 4.8, 4.8. At 80 days, 17, 15, 13, and 30. There was no comparison in growth rates, even though my survival in a controlled challenge was the same. So what happens when we try to create white spot tolerance in an SPF body? Well, we've done that. So here is what I call the CP tolerant line. Commercially, we call that Kong. After exposure to white spot, basically it evens out at 10 to the 3 copies of white spot. That's not going to kill. The non-tolerant, the CP turbo, if it's exposed to white spot, cannot tolerate, goes 10-7, 10-8, it dies. So by putting tolerant genes into the animal, we can have high survival with white spot in an SPF body. Now, what about growth rates? So on the right, I show the growth rates. So CP turbo, can't even figure out what. All right, that's, I don't know what the thing is, but they're relative. We see the turbo is the fastest growing. Okay, we've had a lot more years of selection with turbo than with Kong, the white spot tolerant. But when we look at the white spot tolerant SPF, it's certainly much better than the gray bar, which would be the South American ape line. So SPF now has combined the white spot tolerance with faster growth that is now being selected. We see in the real world, with the Saudi example, that that's an SPF animal with white spot tolerance, and it has made all of the difference in the world to that particular culture. And SPF applies to Monodon as well. You saw the pictures of Monodon back in 2001. Monodon was a dead industry. Wild Monodon were infected, much like the vanamei became in Central America back in 1995. High size variation, slow growth, deteriorating health. But when we clean the viruses out, when we clean the population, all of a sudden, it's beautiful again. It's profitable again. Unfortunately, we've created such a monster with vanamei. If you're not getting disease in the vanamei, you're still going to grow vanamei because your yields are so much higher than with Monodon. But the Monodon has become a good alternative for those farms that have difficulty with vanamei. So why did we do what we did? So this was the CPF thinking. When I went back in 2001, we kind of defined that the problem with the industry was the Monodon, the wild Monodon, is deteriorating. I believed it was infected with whatever. Other people thought it was inbred, whatever. It didn't work any longer. So to create an SPF population from scratch, I had estimated to the company, CP, probably take us 8 years. They weren't going to wait 8 years. They said, can you get the vanamei that's SPF? I said, yeah, that's possible. So let's do vanamei. Now, in the beginning, Thailand had already tried vanamei. And none of the farmers wanted it. I'll never forget after I bring in the SPF vanamei, we got it in the hatchery. I've got my first 8 million PLs. We held a sales meeting. My boss tells the sales guy, okay, we're going to sell this vanamei. He says, no, I don't want to sell the vanamei. The farmers have tried it. It's no good. Well, as a good boss is, he didn't ask them any longer. He told them, you're going to sell it. And so we basically, I brought him back to my office and I said, look, just find people and give it to them. Within 2 months, the phone started ringing. We went from 8 to 16 to 32, and it doubled every month until we were selling 30 billion PLs a year of this new SPF vanamei. It sold itself. It was so different than what they had experienced before when they really did not have an SPF vanamei. We also decided that growth was important because in the poultry industry, we know the faster the chicken grows, the more profit you make, especially in controlled systems. So growth had to be emphasized. Size matters in that large shrimp, one of the few livestock that sell on size, sells for more than small shrimp. So we emphasize growing bigger shrimp. And as an internal consideration, we never wanted to sell a farmer a pathogen. So SPF was ingrained in the company. And as an international supplier of broodstock, it's a major responsibility. The last thing I, or anybody would want to do is to pass on a pathogen to a non-infected or any area. So the amount of surveillance that we put is considerable. So again, pathogen-free animals, must for healthy shrimp, and basis of the biosecurity. This is what happened when we brought the Hawaiian SPF. Remember, they're not tolerant. They're just clean. So this is the reduction of white spot on Thai farms. In 2001, with Monodon that was monitored by PCR to be white spot free Monodon, they still had a 30%, 35% failure rate from white spot. But as we introduced the SPF shrimp, basically it went down to only a 5% loss of white spot in 2010. Essentially, the SPF animals, the clean stocks, reduced the incidence of white spot by reducing the viral loads in the environment. Most white spot came from infected animals, infected PLs. Now we got a rise in white spot in 2016 from the aphids interaction. I can basically infect an animal with aphids, expose it to white spot, it will die much faster than if it's not exposed. So there's a disease interaction there. So as you get aphids, white spot becomes more prevalent again. And here I have a picture of, I think this is one of the broodstock multiplication centers. This would be one of our more modern modular hatcheries in China. Now we all talk about PCR, but PCR is not a substitution for SPF. PCR only without compartmentalization makes lots of mistakes. And here is one example of that mistake. When we started doing so well with the SPF vanamei, the company said, let's do SPF Monodon, but not by the old-fashioned way of quarantines and re-quarantines and time and compartments. Let's just do PCR. PCR the broodstock, make sure they're free of all 8 pathogens, and put that into the system. Well, we did that, but it did not work. The animals were no better than they were before you PCR'd everything. So PCR is not a substitute for creating a genuine SPF program that is based on disease-free compartments. Now, a lot of people think that all of this money we spent and continue to spend on keeping SPF and making sure it's SPF is expensive. It is expensive. You know, I sell broodstock, I think, for $60, $65. I may make $10 because there's $30 in development cost. There's a large expense in doing this right. If you take shortcuts, you will get what shortcuts deliver, and that's not the same result. So here I show basically, this is one of the early slides I think I showed in 2004. You take shrimp out of a pond, they have a healthy appearance, but beneath the surface, they can contain all these viruses. You put that in the hatchery, it goes into the pond, you got problems. So it may be cheap, but it's not cheap in the end. Whereas when we have a genuine, controlled, surveilled, compartmentalized SPF, you don't get those mistakes. You get the results that you're looking for. And when you look at the total cost of broodstock are really less than 1% of total production costs. So, you know, it sounds like a lot, but in the scheme of everything, it's not so much. So this is the nucleus breeding, the compartment. And this shows one of the compartments that we run. This is called MSBC. It's a 14-hectare plot. It's not near the coast. In fact, it's at a rubber plantation. So there's no shrimp farms. It's by island. So it's not surrounded by water, it's surrounded by rice and rubber, but no shrimp farms. So that's the SPF nucleus, and everything is contained. So that water, this farm was commissioned, I think, in 2009. It's the same water I started with in 2009. It's truck saline water, and we've just recycled and reused it since 2009. Yeah, we resupplement it with some calcium and other elements, but it's essentially the same water. You can't pump seawater at this site. It is what you got. And that's critical for biosecurity, because if I had a facility on a site, some employee is going to be tempted to pump water sometime. They can't be tempted here. There is no water to pump. It's based on a compartment with constant pathogen surveillance. Again, it started with carefully quarantined animals. So we quarantined for 6 months. We did a general, more or less small SPF program, goes into the, and so since then it gets locked. We don't bring animals in there. It was locked, this one was locked I think in 2007. Nothing in since 2007, no water since 2009. Then you need the list of pathogens that you're surveilling, because SPF is specific. So you put every pathogen that you know of on the list so you can surveil everything and ensure freedom. It's got the strictest levels of biosecurity. Now, if I went through all the biosecurity, that would be another talk, and that kind of boring. But it's very strict. I do not accept visitors here. In fact, the president of the company has never visited here because he doesn't want to go through the clothes change and the showers and the decontamination to get in the site. And when employees go in, they stay for a week or 2 weeks. So they're kind of confined in this compartment. I got one story. The deputy prime minister or president of the Philippines came, interested in the stock. So he wanted to see the center. I said, look, you're going to have to go through some, you may not think it very presidential. He says, that's okay. This is the right-hand man of Duarte, right? So we put him through hell. I mean, he went through the showers, he got to change into the uniforms and everything. He gets to the other side and he goes, hey, you're approved. Anybody who would do this to me, you got to be good. That was one of the fastest approvals I ever got. It's a completely closed system. So this is my ocean. A number of interlaced reservoirs that undergo various treatments to maintain the water. Completely closed maturation. So we're recirculating within the maturation. Everything is completely closed. We use no fresh feed. I got no polychaetes, I got no squid, I got nothing fresh. Everything is processed. Because again, you cannot it's too much potential if you're using something fresh. So everything here is sterilized. And we actually get very good fecundity with this non-fresh diet. The phytoplankton, again, all enclosed, all secured. This would be the individual family tank room where we create maybe 80 to 100 families every month in every facility that we have. And again, to create a genetic family, the spawn has to be within a 2-day period. So all 80 families will be spawned and reared individually within a 2-day period. So you minimize environmental differences. And then it goes for grow out. Again, everything is contained. This is a totally enclosed broodstock containment. Again, it's within the center where the water's been there since 2009. And it's a flock system. Every time I start a new cycle, it will go in. It'll be totally chlorinated, disinfected, and then there's no water change other than cleaning the bottom and filling up whatever water was removed from cleaning the bottom. And so minimal chances for infection. Then we have multiple layers of surveillance. So the NBC, that's the Nucleus Breeding Center, has its own PCR lab where we do surveillance from the nuclei all the way through the broodstock. Then the NBC lab is surveilled by our central lab. Now that's the lab that undergoes ring testing from Arizona. So they get the quality of the work done twice a year, and then the ring tested lab with the central lab tests the NBC lab to ensure quality. And then the government lab basically is used to certify the facility and for export certification and to check to make sure at a government level the facility is clean. We have multiple centers. You can't run this with one center. There's too much risk. So genetic improvements, the NBCs, the nucleus breeding. I've got 3 for vanamei, 1, 2, and 3. For Monodon, there's 1 on the far right. It's not shown in this. So 3 for vanamei, 1 for Monodon. Broodstock farm, that's multiplication. So the green showed the multiplication centers, 4 multiplication centers. The genetic backup, when you're putting as much money as we put into this, and you had basically an infection, accidental infection, and you lose everything. So every family we create is housed in another location in addition to the NBC. In case there is that accident, we haven't lost all of the money involved in creating 15, 20, 25 generations of shrimp. And then we have the disease challenge centers. There's 1 shown here. I got a new one now too. So there's 1 more disease challenge center. And this shows the list of surveilled pathogens today. And you can see as new pathogens are discovered, they get added to the list. So in 2018, NHB, Div1 was added in, that's SHIV, if you don't know Div1, that was added in 2018, HPV, CMNV was added in 2019, MBV 2021, macrobrachium, notaviruses in well, actually all the way through. The number of tests, this is 1 center, 138,000 tests. I have 4 centers. So 500,000 tests. in this period of time, all negative. And the Challenge Center, this shows one part of a room in a Challenge Center. We have 3,000 tanks to do individual family challenges. Every challenge, I have 5 replicas. And on any month, I can do 3 challenges for every new family that we develop in the program. That's become a very important part. But also at the Challenge Center, that's where I do my pathogen exploration work. So here's one thing that we learned last year, the white feces. I know there's some white feces in certain parts of America. We found that basically it's EHP plus an anaerobic bacteria called Propioninium. It's anaerobic. That's why people don't find it. In fact, we were able to do Koch's postulates. This shows the Koch's postulates here. That we take it, we re-isolate, we put it, we get white feces in one day. If it's EHP positive, EHP negative, nothing. It's got to be the two together. But that's the kind of thing we also do in the Challenge Center, play around with diseases. We basically isolated the Apens bacteria there at the same time Don Leitner did. We created all the management strategies and the mechanism of the pathogen, how it killed, that it was a toxin and really not an infection. So that's the kind of work we do there. Pedigree, for me, defines a genetic program. Too many genetic programs can't show you a pedigree. Unless you can show a pedigree, it's hard to believe you have a serious genetic program. And this shows this is not up to date. It would be much bigger. But what this one does show is each different color is a different founder from the Americas. So these are the original immigrants. And every shrimp that's been in the program, if I was on a live computer and I poke that, I can see all of the data associated with that individual. And it goes all the way down until now you can see, the individuals have a little bit of all the founders in them selected for what you're selecting for. This again would be for one of the 3 sites. I would have an individual pedigree for each of the 3 programs. And there would be differences in the founders. But the way the programs are run are identical. And it's been a real interesting amazement to me that even with different founders, run with the same protocols, they converge in terms of performance. This is an outline of the breeding program. So here is, after 22 generations, we're at 24 generations now, so this is still a little bit dated. We start off with the broodstock. We create with targeted matings the nuclei. We grow those to a PL45. During that time, we'll do all the disease challenges. We'll do initial growth. We will do fecundity analysis, and we'll get enough data that we then can narrow the 60 families, in this case, down to 10 to 12 families. Those 10 to 12 families then are put and co-grown in large raceways, tagged, so that we have both individual names and family names, and then we further select those out to target sizes. In the end, we will select about 5% of a family, and individuals will be down to 1%. So the target is when we go in to select, if we can mate the 1%, that's what gets mated. If not, we have another 4% as backup in that family. For commercial, it's a different set of criteria. So I'm using a lot of inbreeding criteria, family likeliness criteria, some genetic stuff that's not pure performance. Again, to maintain more variance in the populations. For commercial, it's all about performance. So we will select the 2 best performing families for commercial. They may not be the same as the genetic families, or they may, but they're different sets of criteria. Now, we also use indexing, and the index is a living tool. So depending on what we feel is important to the farmer is how we'll weight an index. So here are different weights: growth, TSV, apins, white spot, robustness, and reproduction. And the number of plus signs indicates the weight I put in the index. And then we see as the years go by, initially 2004, 2007, that was TSV was dominating. So that's where the weight went. When TSV became a non-factor, the weight went to growth with a little bit of TSV, a little bit of robustness. In 2013, when apins came in, the weight went almost all to apins. Very little growth, very little of the other things. Now, presently, we've taken a little bit of weight off the apins. We've put the weight on white spot, especially in the Kong line, and we've really revved up, it's kind of an obscure characteristic of robustness. Basically, the ability to maintain these strong immune systems in spite of environmental factors. Turbo is the commercial name of our stock that was, I'd say, born in 2008. That was the end of the first development cycle, where it was basically understood to be a faster growing shrimp. And so it grew fast. It also had requirements that were different from the original slower growing shrimp, of which we had to teach the farmers. We had to do the technical transfers so farmers could be successful with it. So this kind of shows the changes of Turbo over the years. This would have been 2002. This would have been the original SPF stock from Hawaii. 350 individuals per gram at a, I think these are PL8s or PL9s. Again, it's SPF, it's healthy. They're uniform. They're active. But if we go to 2018, we're at 40 per gram of that same PL number. Very, very different. But again, uniform size, they're healthy. So that is truly a genetic change. If we go to ponds, in 2000, this should be 2004, not 2014. 2004, this was an Indonesian pond that I was sampling. It was 100 days old. It was 17 grams. That was considered good or average back then. Go to 2019, and now we're looking at 38 grams, 80 days with a 20-day nursery. Today, we do even better than that. And this harvest on the left is from last month. This is a winter crop in Thailand. So this is not the optimum growing time, and yet we're still getting 40 grams in 90 days from what we call a super PL. A super PL is a PL that is about 20 days old. So from a PL 20, 90 days, 40-gram shrimp, in a suboptimal time of year in Thailand. It was 30 tons per hectare. It was 84% survival. These are happy farmers. Now, on the odd list, this was a Malaysian harvest right before Chinese New Year, 3 years ago. Harvested 160-gram shrimp. It had been grown for 180 days. There was 5 tons per hectare of that. That's the largest vanamei production shrimp that I'm aware of. And here, again, would be another more normal harvest for a farmer looking to grow larger shrimp, 42 grams in 100 days. You'll notice all the antennae are intact. They're healthy shrimp. So selective genetics, as I said, we're targeting growth because that's of high economic importance, but it's only highly economically important if they live. So never get it wrong. If they don't live, we're not selecting it. Survival is first, but survival oftentimes is having the tolerance and the management. But what we see here is, again, I think you'll find interesting. So this is Monodon in 2009. Basically a higher growth rate than the vanamei. Or sorry, 2004. Okay, 2009 Monodon, 2004 vanamei. Monodon, faster growth rate. We've all been brought up to think Monodon grows faster than vanamei. Now, after selection, vanamei is now growing faster than Monodon. So the bottom orange is the original vanamei growth, and the growth today is up there. And we've seen that we've also moved the Monodon growth rate up, but it's not going to catch the vanamei growth rate. The vanamei will continue to grow faster. And we continue to improve about 10% per generation with the vanamei, even after all the selection we've done. The problem we find now is it grows a little bit too fast for broodstock. So Dr. Davis was alluding, we grow our broodstock at 25, 22% protein, so they don't grow so fast because I need age. You need 170, 180 days. If I grow at high protein at 170, 180 days, they're like 130 grams, and no maturation room wants it. So by lowering the protein, we can keep them at the target size 55 grams in the 170, 180 days. So we've got the turbo, that's the fast-growing stock. It is the preferred stock in Asia when they've got the controlled pond systems. It gives the highest profits. And here is such a system that's actually been developed in Central America. It looks pretty much identical to an Asian farm, and it's worked very, very well. So basically, it's not Asian. You can move these technologies around the world. The principles remain the same. So you see here, you can't see it in this, but they've got a central toilet. They've got the auto feeders. They got aeration. They needed a little more aeration. I think they've added that now, especially if they get a newer stock. Now I showed this for two reasons. One, hatchery performance changes too, but most hatcheries don't see that change because they haven't changed management. When you have new genetic stock, you have to change management to keep up with it. So if I feed the same rate, I'm going to get the same size. If I change my management, I will change the size if the genetic potential is there. So this is the same group of Nuclei. Half of the Nuclei were grown one way, half were grown another way. One was adopted to new management for a better growing stock, and the other was grown the old-fashioned way. And you can see the difference. This is the same genetics, but different culture management. Little guys, big guys. If I today change management in a hatchery, and that's modifying a lot of things, but optimize the management, I can grow a 0.9 gram shrimp in 20 days in the hatchery. But you have to change the management to match the genetics. Here's another graph again just showing the progressive improvement. So the bottom black line is 2004, the top red line is 2021. That's an average size between male and female. Our male and female really do not distinguish until they reach 40 grams. That's one of the reasons we get higher harvests. They do not start differentiating at 20 or 25 grams. They differentiate more at 40 grams and up. And so you maintain a faster growth rate to larger sizes. And on the right, you can see, again, the change in farm performance. So in 2005, I show an average size of harvest in the bars. So you're 12 grams in 2005. It was, not too exciting. As we go through, especially as we break 2014, 2015, where we put another component into the genetics program, robustness. So this is not necessarily selection for growth per se. It's selecting for more robustness, which allows the animal to take advantage of the growth in the system. And so we saw a massive improvement in growth in 2015, 2016 that could not be attributed to the genetic selection of growth. And then we look at the sizes being harvested, the maximum size. So before, the maximum size may be 22 grams. 30, it's in the 30 gram range. But after we put the robustness characteristics in there, our sizes go up over 50 grams, 60 grams, 65 grams in a normal grow-out cycle. I think we've already seen the disease challenge work, but TSB, almost 100%, EMS, 80%, starting this after EMS affected Thailand in 2012, immediately creating the challenge. And again, for any of these diseases, when you're creating the tolerance, the first step is to understand the disease enough that you can create a replicating challenge. So how you infect, how long. So it's not you just challenge. It took us 1 year to develop the challenge test for aphids. And I think other places really never even developed an effective challenge test because they couldn't repeat it. It wasn't repeatable. And for a challenge test to be useful, it must be repeatable. Growth rate has also decreased the FCRs. So here I show a scatter. This is from basically, I think, 1 year or a couple of years of data, 2 years maybe, where I look at, this is harvest. So at harvest, what is the FCR? So for whatever reasons, these animals were harvested at 40 days, and you can see it's down here. And as you go up to higher harvest, so again, FCR is related to growth rate. Before, when I was in Guatemala and Belize, we thought FCR was related to size. You grow big shrimp, you're gonna pay more in FCR. That's a certain component, but only as the days. So as we've grown the same size shrimp in shorter days, the FCR has not had to go up considerably. And you can, if you have enough data, you can correlate DOC with FCR. So, we could potentially get down to 1.0, 1.1 in large shrimp if we can grow the shrimp that fast. For me, it makes a little bit of sense because you've got energy components. You've got growth. Okay, that's constant. If it's growing to 30 grams, growth energy. Then you got maintenance. The longer it's in the pond, the more maintenance. And then you got reproduction, not important. So it really is about the maintenance energy cost, which is the time in the pond. This shows how the harvest sizes have changed in Thailand. So this is 2006. 30-gram harvests were 0% in 2006. And then as we moved through, we saw the sizes getting bigger. Until 2021, greater than 30 grams was over 45% of the harvest. And I just did a summation in the first few months of 2022. It's going closer to 50% now. And we're getting harvest in the 50 and 60 gram mark with these animals. And of course, this is really the only way Thailand can survive now is with larger, more valuable animals and value processing because of the cost. Now, oftentimes, broodstock get blamed for everything. And so I take a little bit of exception to that because the farmers are not buying broodstock, they're buying PLs. And a hatchery can mess up a good broodstock. I mean, I used to sell broodstock into China and to Vietnam, and the first thing they do is go throw wild polychaetes on top of them, and they're infected with white feces, apins, white spot, they got everything. And so they're selling those PLs, the farmer's not doing so well, and they're going, oh, it's your broodstock. Yeah, it's our broodstock, but you gotta maintain the SPF status in the hatchery. You have to maintain a good quality PL because farmers buy the PLs, they don't buy the broodstock. Hatcheries buy broodstock, farmers buy PLs. And so hatcheries that buy broodstock and then mess up the PL, that's a disfavor to the farmer. And unfortunately, that's why China is not recovered. That's why a lot of farms do not recover because they think they're getting good broodstock, but the hatchery is not doing the job to keep the animal clean. Today, the biggest issue, the biggest problem in hatcheries is keeping EHP out. EHP is a very difficult pathogen to keep out. But unless you keep it out, you pass those PLs on to a farmer, he's going to have a losing crop. So first thing for modern hatcheries for me, and the first thing that I did when we went over, I changed hatcheries to modular designs. So we can run 12 months a year without any interruption in production and quality of that production. So here I show a hatchery. This hatchery here is in Vietnam. It's a new hatchery that's just being built. This is an artist diagram. One on Hainan Island in China. And this is one of our SPF hatcheries modularized in Malaysia. All the hatcheries pretty much run with the same principles, and they run consistently. We can run 12 months a year. Some of these hatcheries haven't shut down completely, for 5 years. Now, different modules shut down. And when I say modular, everything. So a 5 modular hatchery will have 5 entire hatcheries within the boundaries of the one hatchery. It'll be modular to that point, where the algae is modular, reservoirs are modular, everything is modular. And in today's environment, disinfection is it's imperative. So, we generally use ozone, combination of ozone and chlorine, physical filtration for EHP. Now, this particular unit won't remove EHP, but we have more ultrafiltration in hatcheries that are in EHP environments to make sure you remove the spores, because it's very difficult to disinfect a spore. Really, the only successful way of dealing with it has been through physical removal, filtration. So you need special filtration for that. Again, the water looks very good. I mean, that's always one criteria. And then we're basically putting a UV light on the air room, so all the air that's blown in has been disinfected to an extent with the UV lights. And in maturation, it's a complete no-no, at least in a CP hatchery, to use anything wild. So all the polychaetes we grow in our own cultured polychaete farms, and those are again monitored, so they're not going to bring in the things that we know polychaetes carry. SHIV1 or DIV1, it carries. EHP, apins, those are the main issues with wild polychaetes, but they're major issues. And special maturation diets, again, when it's processed diets, you're not going to bring in a disease. Closed water systems whenever we can. So all of our maturation is closed and totally controlled. The efficiency on these systems generally will be in the range of 30 to 45 million nuclei per 1,000 females. One of the distinguishing observations or shocks, when I go into a South American maturation room, they're huge. Our maturation rooms are small. Again, the cost of our broodstock says I can't fuel a huge maturation room, so we depend on the efficiency of the broodstock more than the size of the maturation room. Monitoring PL quality is, again, something that not enough hatcheries are doing. Now, there's many tests. There's a stress test, growth rate in the hatchery I like, CV of the PLs I like, but the most effective has been monitoring TCBS. We have found that if the green colonies are greater than 10 to the third per gram of PL, high probability of pond failure. If yellow colonies are greater than 10 to the 4, high probability of failure. So we like to maintain the Vibrio levels low. Again, we don't do that with antibiotics. You do that with clean systems. You do that by maintaining the health of the system. So the future. I think the future is getting rid of what I call the non-specific mortality that we have now, the normalized background. So go over to the right. So we look at the modern poultry industry. This would be from CP Poultry. They have 95% survival on average. And the confidence bar is very narrow. It's like plus or minus 3%. It's very predictable. Shrimp can be the same way. So here is my shrimp broodstock raceway. I've got 95% survival in that raceway for 10 years. Hardly any variation. Sometimes maybe 92, sometimes 98. But it's like poultry. So if we basically had high survivals with no variation, we could deal with very low margins. We could produce a lot more shrimp and not be worried about markets because our margins could be as tight as poultry. Now, poultry's got a little, it's an airborne, it's easier to deal with a little bit, but what this has shown to me is shrimp don't just die. They die for a reason. And if you can cover your bases, they don't have to die. So in 2010, in Thailand, we were at 85% survival as an industry. And the CV, okay, it's not as good as a raceway, but it's much better than it is in 2014, where it was all over. And even today, in 2019, the variance is much higher than we had in 2010. Even though we've had, and again, we're at 68% in 2019, 70%. We were 85, we lost 15% survival points for no name. It's just, that's the way it is. It's normalized now. But what if we could get the 15% back? What if we could reduce the variance? This, to me, is where the next major breakthroughs will come when we learn how to do that. So learning new concepts in biosecurity. This shows the power of the immune system. So what I have here are 3 families. I've got some immune peptides, looking at the expression, and then a challenge with EMS. And we can see that family 26, the blue family, with 63% survival against the apins, it has a higher immune peptide, some much higher. The ones with the lower survival have a lower immune peptide level. So if we have these in families, can we breed families with higher immune peptides? I call that robustness. So if I can have a higher immune peptide level, and I can maintain that even in a stressed condition, I will improve the survival against all of the background pathogens that happen to be in a pond. As a management, minimize stress. So when I'm talking about our raceways, there is no oxygen stress. Nitrites, there is no nitrite stress. Everything is controlled. So we minimize stress, we can have high survivals. In ponds, especially intensive ponds, it gets more challenging. But for me, that's the challenge of engineers, that's the challenge of management, and how we can reduce the stresses in the ponds and at the same time improve the breeding that targets immune peptide systems. And for control, there's certainly in Asia the trend is smaller and smaller and smaller. And there's no question, as you go smaller, your yields per unit area go up, and your success rate goes up. The control is much easier. You can spend more money on that control because you're more intense. And that really is where the industry is going to go. The smaller and smaller ponds that can be controlled, and we have much more consistent. I mean, if I've got a small pond, I can even screen out EHP. I can do all kinds of things on a small intensive pond to remove stresses, to remove potential pathogens that I can't do in a large, less intensive pond. And again, as resources become more valuable, efficiencies become more important, we're going smaller and smaller. Vietnam is probably in the lead. There's certainly farms in China that are also going smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's the only way they can make money relative to having consistent harvest. The discovery of new pathogens in the old days was really, really painful. It took a lot of time. It took us how long to find EMS? EMS first happened in 2009. I saw it first in 2009, Fujian province. And Dr. Leitner, I don't think, if I remember right, made his discovery until 2013. We knew early on that it was a bacteria. We didn't know which bacteria. In fact, in the very beginning, both Dr. Leitner and myself thought it was Shionella, but that could not be recreated using Koch's postulate. So we went on and found that it's not Shionella, but in every animal that was dying of EMS, there was Shionella, as well as the Vibrio that we finally identified in the gastric mills because it's chitinoclastic, so it attaches and colonizes the clastic mills. But with the onset of metagenomics and RNA blasting, we had a new virus. We had the problems I said in Brazil. We employed a metagenomic RNA approach, and we uncovered a wingzoo virus, number 8. It took about 3 weeks. And then you validate it with in situ hybridization. And so from a 3-year, 4-year process, you can get answers very, very quickly if you're employing the new technology of metagenomics, combining it with in situ, so you can validate that it's a disease and not just some piece of DNA that you've uncovered in the blast. And then genomics for the genetics also. As we got full sequences now, give credit to Dr. Jian Hai of creating the first fully annotated sequence of vanamei. With this, we can now, if you've got the tools, as say we do in our Challenge Center, we can now create the contrast to identify workable SNPs so that we can use molecular typing on an individual basis, which will be so much more powerful than family, to move genetics much faster than they have in the past at lower cost. High cost in the beginning to develop the SNPs, multiple characteristics, but in the end, once you have this multiple characteristic SNP chip, you'll be able to tailor the needs on an individual basis of the broodstock that you need, or this farm needs, or whatever the characteristics are. We'll be able to identify those and do more tailoring to the different needs of individual requirements. So far, we've got 2 characteristics that we got SNPs for. I got a white spot. I've got a TSV. But in the future, I want a robustness, or I want a survival, where basically I can identify characteristics that allow the shrimp to survive in our ponds. And if we can identify these type of characteristics, then again, we will be able to make breeding much more targeted than it is today. So this is, I say 2022, introducing our CP Kong. So again, we used classical challenges to create the SNP chips. And then basically from there, we can fine-tune the selection with an epigenetic approach. Now, epigenetics is taking the same gene and methylating it in different ways. When you methylate it in different ways, you get different products, you get different results. So the gene is the same, but by changing the methylation patterns, we can change the response. We can make it hardier, we can make it more robust. So selection followed by epigenetics. We have a lot more tools to improve the animal today than we did just 3 or 4 years ago. CP Kong, again, growth rate is slower than turbo, but it's not bad. It has much higher survival against the white spot. It's got more robustness. So it does better in those ponds with poor biosecurity. So we're selling this in China, ponds that don't have good biosecurity. We're selling it in Iran, ponds don't have good survival. Iran had its best year ever last year with the animal. SPF with high enough white spot tolerance, robustness, that it didn't die even though biosecurity is minimal. Hoping to find other homes for the CP Kong. Also, it has lower oxygen requirements. It's just an easier, but it does work best when stocked less than 40, so it minimizes pond stress. You can kill anything, as I said, if the stress goes up. And finally, I just want to, talk a little bit about, it's not one thing. It's not broodstock, it's not PLs, it's not feed, it's everything. If you want success, I call this holistic. Too often, it'll all be about the feed, or it'll all be about the broodstock, or it's not. It's about everything tied together and working together. And only if we take that holistic picture will we have true success and I think sustainability into the future. I just got very tired of people, it's the broodstock problem, Or it's in the early days, in the 1990s, it was feed. Had a bad crop, feed was bad. Then it moved to, we had a wave of, oh, it's inbreeding. Oh, it's this. No, it's everything. Everything has to be in tune, in sync. Otherwise, you're not going to get the result that you deserve, that we will need as we move forward. Okay, final slide. This is ultrafiltration for EHP on a farm in Thailand. So actually a farm can basically survive with EHP when they filter all of the water that goes into the farm through this filter and remove the spores. Difference between failure and success is filtration like this. It's not nearly as expensive as the filtration I'll put in a hatchery. It's not necessarily cheap either, but when it comes to the difference between making money and losing money, this filtration has turned many a farm around. In fact, farms that put this in, they paid this investment back very quickly, and they started rebuying their Mercedes after one crop. Whereas before, they were having to sell their Mercedes to stay afloat. So with that, I want to thank you. That's basically, I think, what I had for today. Probably didn't use my 2 hours.
Okay.
Too fast, no?
No, it's okay. So good, very good presentation. So we have some questions here around. Perdón. ¿Tenemos algunas preguntas por aquí? ¿Sí tenemos preguntas? Ahí hay una pregunta.
Sí, para que la traduzca, Salvador, por favor.
Sí.
Sí, ¿cuáles son los principales retos que considera ahorita de la camaronicultura para México y Latinoamérica en materia de salud? Salud de los camarones.
¿La mejor que, perdón?
El mayor reto, considera.
Para el crecimiento de la camonicultura en México, por ejemplo, ¿sí?
Sí, y en Ecuador, y en Latinoamérica.
Okay, so
I really haven't been here that often to know what the major challenge is. I think the major challenge is to continue to improve whatever you do and evolve to having more and more efficiency, meaning cost effectiveness in the systems. So if survival is holding you back, you've got to look at ways of remedying survival. If survival is not holding you back, but you want lower costs, growth rate is a great way to lower costs if survival is not the problem. If food conversion is a problem, growth rates can sometimes take care of that, survival, overall management. But I think my story for the whole world will be as we intensify. And I think the only way we grow the industry is through intensification. I think the days of creating more Ecuadors are over. I don't think we're going to move, we're at, say, 5 million tons now. Let's say you want to go to 7 million tons. We're not going to add 2 million tons more by developing that much more acres of Ecuadorian style. It's going to have to be a more intensive culture. And even Ecuador recognizes that as they add the aerators and they add the auto feeders, and they creep up on their density. I think, for Ecuador, there probably will be a cap at which point the density will run into some diseases. And then they are going to have to look at changing their broodstock normal. But at this point, clearly the data shows that it works. How long it will continue to work if they continue to move it up? You can always add more aerators. You can always do this and do that. But at some point, the stresses will start to affect shrimp that have pathogens. And if you're not running an SPF program, you will have pathogens. I mean, I saw that in Brazil. I mean, that is so clear. And in Guatemala as well. There's EHP everywhere in the Americas. But we only have disease in Guatemala and Brazil that I know of. And that's where they intensify, to the point of Asian intensification. I know in India, where they're at 30 per square meter, they're not as serious with EHP as they go to 50. Then it becomes a serious problem. So at some point, you've got to change more of the technology as you continue to intensify. In Asia, as we continue to intensify, clearly the small half-hectare pond is too big. We can't control it with the diseases and all of the challenges in the environment. So we have to cut that down to the point that we're going away from ponds to more tanks. Tanks are the easiest. It also has higher, lower requirements for horsepower and aeration. You get more oxygen with less horsepower. So you have more efficiency in large tanks, 400-ton tanks, 600-ton tanks, than you do in earthen ponds. But in ponds, you'll have 1,000 meters square. At this point, if it's a new farm, 2,000 meters square might be big. As they get smaller and smaller, compensate with higher density, and yet more control where they have higher percentage of success. They still get the big shrimp. They can still do 50-gram shrimp if the conditions are good. The one beautiful thing about vanamei, if you keep the conditions good, it's not density sensitive. It will grow fast if you can maintain the conditions. It's just that as the densities go up, those conditions get more difficult to maintain. But if you can maintain conditions, clean bottoms, good oxygen, constant, they love constant temperature. If I had the choice of growing a shrimp at an average of 26 degrees versus an average of 30 degrees, I'll pick the 26 degrees if I can keep it 26 plus or minus 0.5 versus a 30 plus or minus 2 or plus or minus 3. Variance has maybe more impact than the mean of a temperature. Oxygen, again, when I started, the target oxygen was don't go below 5. When I was in the Americas, the target was don't go below 4 or 3.5. And then as we got better, it was don't go below 5. And then it was don't go below, by 2010, it was don't go below 5.5. And today, the target is let's not go below 5.8 or 6. If you maintain 6, you get much less EHP than if you drift down to 5. Again, it's the stress. Animals that exhibit higher stress get sick and infected more often. So those are the things. It's nothing specific. I don't deal in specifics. I deal in general principles. Those are the principles. Minimize stress, buy a good, clean animal so you're not infecting the pond, and the efficiencies will take care of themselves.
Thank you.
Está traduciendo el traductor, ¿verdad? Qué bueno. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Ahí está otra pregunta.
Thank you, Robin, for a fantastic presentation. It's really a pleasure. Just a couple of comments or ideas. In Asia, you mentioned that you sell PL. Are you not afraid of people taking the PLs and breeding them?
Should I be?
Yeah. And the other point is, in Asia, the industry relies on companies producing the breeders, and they conduct genetics. And in Latin America, we...
All right, I got the gist, okay? This is a major problem with breeding companies. We have no intellectual protection, none. So I put in $12 million US a year. I've done it for 18 years. You can do the math. Plus the facilities, which have another, 40 or $50 million invested. And yet, if you know a friend in Thailand and you know how to smuggle to Singapore, you can have the animals in a week.
Yeah.
That's the fact. I've come to accept the fact because no matter how I look at the laws, even in the United States, nobody's breaking a law by stealing my stuff.
Yeah.
Now, I could take the opinion of, say, a George or this person and say, I'm not going to sell. If I don't sell, I don't do business. Mm-hmm. You don't sell, you don't hold it, you don't do business. So I have the opinion or the attitude or maybe misconception that I am going to guarantee quality, and when you buy from me, you know it's original and you know it's the best and it's up to date and you can guarantee on it. If you buy it from XYZ over here, you don't know if they've mixed it, kept it clean, 2 generations back, So I have to continue to improve. I have to keep looking forward and making forward products with the hope that we can stay far enough ahead with enough reliability that it's appreciated that people would rather buy an original than a second.
And the concept of, in Latin America, every big producer tends to have their own breeding center.
Yeah.
It's something that can be maintained, or
It's about cost.
It's
okay,
cost.
so if in fact you want to do what we do, as I said, I spend $12 million a year. Okay, now maybe I overdo it. Some people go, oh, you overdo it. Well, maybe I do. I won't say that I don't overdo it, but I do say this, that if we hadn't done what we did, the industry wouldn't be where it is today. So a lot of people have benefited by our overdoing it. And I don't think we would have had the advances that we have today if I hadn't overdone it. So in hindsight, can somebody do what I do and do it lower cost? Especially if he starts with maybe some advanced material to start with? Yeah, maybe. But, and I think that's the pity of the industry. Because if we decide to quit, there is no other. Nobody else has the efforts that we have of moving things forward and then loaning them out, if you want to call it that. So, it is a challenge. I mean, my break-even point, so a small farmer, if you do what I do, what CP does, and you're selling the animals, $55 at an FOB, I have to sell over 250,000 broodstock a year to break even. So if you've got a large enough farm, and again, these are not low fecundity animals. My numbers of broodstock in most countries have gone down because the fecundity has doubled over the years. When you're producing 40 million nuclei per 1,000 females, you don't need a lot of females to do what you're going to do, especially if you got survivals in the hatchery of 60%, which I would say is more a normal in a good hatchery in Asia than a not normal, right? So it really takes a large market to support this. And so, yeah, you can do it, but you're not going to be spending 12 million. You're probably not going to be spending 4 million. And it's all about size. Every year I do 4,000 families. Now, doing a families, it's easy to say 4,000 families. It's very difficult to go and evaluate 4,000 families and make selections and keep them going. There's an expense to that. There's also an expense, as I said, I have a backup for everything. Now, it would be foolish if I didn't have a backup, because if we had a mistake, I would lose all of that money. One thing that money cannot buy, it can't buy time. So to do what we did took 20 years. If I lost it all, I'd have to go back 20 years and do it again. You can't buy that with money. So have to have the backup so we don't lose all of that money with an unforeseen accident. In the disease center, that's just necessary relative to understanding all the new challenges that come along and the ability to create, the new technologies that we need. So there's an expense there too that I have to expense against broodstock, right? And then multiplication, that's just a mini with the same biosecurity as a Nucleus breeding, but it's specialized in just growing out broodstock.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? I have a question for you. Do you think that in the middle long term, if Western Hemisphere is not using SPF or fast grow PLs, it is going to be less competitive in the market?
Take the fast growth off. If the trend is continue to intensify, and where that point comes, I don't know. But let's look out 10 years. I think intensification is a given. At some point, non-SPF will crack. Growth rate is not important. It's just that the animal is clean. So if you don't have clean animals, I think that we will have new headlines. And even today, this is happening today, but nobody's recognizing it. So there's one thing that happened, another thing is to recognize it. So do you think that the problems in Guatemala are recognized as a broodstock problem? Do you think that, the Brazilian issue is recognized as a broodstock problem? No, many of those people think it's inbreeding. They think it's bad pond management, but it's not. Nobody wants to recognize broodstock programs. Nobody wants to change what they're used to doing. And yes, the pond systems have, served Latin America very well. But again, if I look at the statistics, Latin America just started growing. Asia grew with the SPF model to 3-4x in 8 years with the SPF model plus biosecurity and control. So at some point, it'll be just like domestication. If you went back to 1998, there was no domesticated animals in the Americas. Maybe a few in Colombia, what we had in Belize from Hawaii, but the rest was wild. And it took some really catastrophic events to change. White spot was that event. I mean, as before white spot, pretty much wild, and after white spot, 2 years, pretty much trying to go the domesticated route. So white spot was that defining moment. Now, Scott Horton is here. He had a defining moment, but that's with the slow growth, where animals stopped growing in Guatemala, and they lost money, not because they necessarily all died, but it's just poor performance. And he faced I'm going to have to shut the farm down because he's lost money for, 3 years or whatever, right? I have one more chance. What are you going to do? Well, try domesticated stock and see what happens. It changed the history of Guatemala. It actually started to change the history of Central America. But it takes a defining moment. Unless you're pushed, you don't change. I mean, Asia was a monodon country. So when we brought in the clean white shrimp, Suratani was the last holdout with monodon. And the president would come up to me and says, "We will never change. We will never change. We are black tiger." 2 years later, he's white shrimp. Because economic necessity drives change. If there's no economic necessity, what's comfortable you keep doing. But there's a few individuals that aren't necessarily interested in they want to do better. Status quo, no good. If you have status quo with a slow dribble like Asia had, it was a dribble, right? From year to year, you didn't even recognize it until one day you wake up and you're losing money. And then it's crisis time. But status quo is easier to be comfortable with than a change, especially a change of going from black tiger to vanamei, going from a pond-reared vanamei to maybe an SPF vanamei. You have to be pushed by economic necessity. And today, if we look at most of Latin America, they're doing okay. Could they do better? Maybe, I don't know, but they're doing okay. They're not being pushed to change.
Good enough. Muy bien, thank you. Muy bien, ¿alguna otra pregunta por aquí? Hay algunas preguntas you have some questions online, so Jaime Vaquerizo, he's asking, you did not consider robustness importance in 2013 in your weight getting scale. From 2003 to 2013, never was considered robustness important factor on weight equation, you think? Robustness?
Again, robustness. What's the question on robustness? We didn't consider it earlier.
You don't consider it when you weighted scale.
We really didn't understand robustness. So we didn't really understand robustness. So if you don't understand it, it's hard to put in the scale. It really wasn't until some of the experiences with the EMS and trying to answer why things were happening and really doing introspective thought processes that the term robustness came to the front. Then how do you define it? If you can't define it, you can't select it. And so specifically, no, we didn't select for robustness. We would select for overall survival. So we have, what I didn't go in, we have basically field trials, to every family, and that field trial would be to validate the selections that it lived in field conditions. It wasn't a strong selection, it was just a validation. It wasn't until we really started to internalize what does robustness mean, and by understanding and defining it, now you can create selection. So we didn't emphasize it because we hadn't defined it. You don't define it, you can't select it.
Muy bien. Voy a dar por terminar la conferencia. Hay algunas otras preguntas aquí. I'm going to send you some questions of the audience later on,
Okay.
so you can contact directly and answer them. There are so many questions about, but you already answered everything almost. I mean, some people from Ecuador is asking about if you think the SPF is better than we are doing now, whatever. But you already say that this is an economic factor. If they want to,
better or worse, it's basically what works and makes money, right?
yeah, I know. So they need to have this point of change, and they are good now. They can be better, probably.
What they're doing now is fine. I mean, look, they made a 150,000 ton increase last year.
Yeah, right.
Using their model or whatever it is, right?
Yeah, right.
So as long as it's working, as long as the trend line is strong, I will say this though, when I look at world shrimp history, whenever growth exceeds 30% for 3 or more years, watch out.
Ok. Bien, muy bien. Le damos un reconocimiento a Robbins por su conferencia. Thank you very much.